Imagine standing in the scorching heat of ancient Mesopotamia, surrounded by endless stretches of desert and dusty plains. Suddenly, rising before you like something from a fever dream, you see cascading walls of green vegetation flowing down from terraced stone platforms 75 feet high. Exotic flowers perfume the air, their fragrances drifting on the wind as cool water trickles through channels carved into massive limestone blocks. Trees heavy with fruit sway gently above your head, their roots somehow thriving in mid-air, defying every law of nature you thought you understood. This was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a marvel so extraordinary that ancient writers described it with the same awe reserved for encounters with gods. For over 2,000 years, historians, poets, and dreamers have celebrated these impossible gardens as the crown jewel of human achievement. There's just one problem with this legendary wonder that has captivated humanity for millennia. It might never have existed, not where we've been looking for it anyway. And the truth behind this ancient mystery is far stranger than any legend ever written. Tonight, we're diving into one of archaeology's most perplexing puzzles, a story that will take us from the ruins of Babylon to the forgotten palaces of Assyria, through centuries of mistaken identity and archaeological confusion that has fooled scholars for over 2,000 years. Because what if everything we thought we knew about the Hanging Gardens was wrong? What if the most famous garden in human history has been hiding in plain sight, just not where anyone thought to look? The story begins in 225 BCE with a Greek writer named Philo of Byzantium, who compiled the first official list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These weren't just impressive buildings, they were theamata, meaning things to be seen, the ultimate travel guide for wealthy Greeks and Romans, exploring the conquered territories of Alexander the Great's vast empire. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Colossus of Rhodes, each wonder represented the pinnacle of human ambition and engineering prowess. But among these 7 marvels, the Hanging Gardens stood apart. While the other wonders were monuments to gods, kings, or the dead, the gardens were described as something entirely different, a living paradise that transformed the harsh Mesopotamian landscape into an oasis of impossible beauty. Classical writers painted pictures so vivid they seemed almost magical, terraced gardens rising like green mountains from the earth, supported by massive stone columns and watered by ingenious mechanical systems that lifted river water hundreds of feet into the air. According to the most popular version of the story, the gardens were built by King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon around 600 BCE as a gift to his homesick wife, Queen Amytis. She had come from the green, mountainous region of Media in what is now northwestern Iran, and legend claimed she pined for the natural beauty of her homeland while trapped in the flat, dusty plains surrounding Babylon. So the king, madly in love and impossibly wealthy, decided to recreate the mountains themselves, building layer upon layer of hanging terraces filled with every exotic plant, tree, and flower his empire could provide. It's a beautiful story, romantic, ambitious, and perfectly suited to our image of ancient Babylon as a place of unimaginable wealth and power. Nebuchadnezzar II was, after all, one of history's greatest builders, the man who constructed Babylon's legendary walls, the spectacular Ishtar Gate, and the towering ziggurat that may have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel. If anyone could build a wonder of the world, it would be him. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. After 2 centuries of excavation at the ancient site of Babylon, located about 50 miles south of modern Baghdad, archaeologists have found absolutely nothing. No trace of the gardens. No evidence of the sophisticated water systems needed to sustain them. No foundations, no terraces, no advanced hydraulic engineering, nothing. This isn't for lack of trying. German archaeologist Robert Koldewy spent 20 years at the turn of the 20th century methodically excavating every square inch of ancient Babylon. He unc'd the remains of the Ishtar-Gateavad Nebuchadnezzar's palaces, mapped the city's streets and temples. In the northeastern corner of the royal palace, he discovered what he thought might be the gardens, a series of unusual vaulted chambers and foundation rooms that could have supported massive terraces. But even Koldewey admitted the evidence was circumstantial at best. Since then, generations of archaeologists have combed through Babylon's 4 square miles of ruins, armed with increasingly sophisticated technology. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, chemical analysis of soil samples, every tool of modern archaeology has been deployed in the search for the gardens. The results have been consistently, frustratingly empty. This presents us with an archaeological paradox that has puzzled scholars for decades. We have detailed contemporary records of almost every other ancient wonder. The Great Pyramid still stands. We know exactly where the lighthouse of Alexandria was built. The ruins of the Temple of Artemis have been excavated and studied. But the Hanging Gardens, supposedly the most spectacular wonder of them all, have left behind no physical trace whatsoever. Even more puzzling, Nebuchadnezzar II himself never mentioned building any gardens. This was a king who loved to boast about his construction projects, leaving behind countless inscriptions detailing every temple, palace, and wall he built. He wrote extensively about his achievements, his conquests, his architectural innovations. But in all of his surviving texts, and we have many, there is not a single reference to hanging gardens, elevated terraces, or advanced water-lifting systems. This silence from Babylon's greatest builder is deafening. It's as if the most famous construction project in ancient history never happened, at least not where everyone thinks it did. The mystery deepens when we examine the ancient sources more carefully. The earliest written reference to the gardens comes from Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing around 290 BCE, but his account has only survived in fragments quoted by later historians. Most of our detailed descriptions come from much later Greek and Roman writers, Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, Quintus Curtius Rufus, who were writing centuries after the gardens supposedly existed, none of whom had ever seen them personally. These later accounts are vivid but contradictory. Some describe the gardens as square, others as rectangular. Some place them next to the royal palace, others suggest they were built on the banks of the Euphrates River. The engineering descriptions vary wildly, with some sources describing primitive water-lifting devices, while others reference sophisticated screw-like mechanisms that wouldn't be invented for centuries. Most tellingly, while several sources do attribute the gardens to a Babylonian king, not all of them name Nebuchadnezzar II. Some simply refer to a Syrian king, which in ancient terminology could refer to any ruler in the broader Mesopotamian region. This vagueness is strange for what should have been one of the most famous building projects in ancient history. For modern archaeologists and historians, this lack of evidence presents a fundamental challenge. How do you study something that might never have existed? How do you separate legend from reality when the legend has become more powerful than any physical evidence? Some scholars have suggested that the Hanging Gardens were purely mythical, a fantasy invented by Greek writers to symbolize the exotic luxury of the conquered Persian Empire. Others argue that they existed but were destroyed so completely that no trace remains, perhaps swept away by the changing course of the Euphrates River or demolished by later conquerors. But there's a third possibility, one that has emerged from decades of careful research by a brilliant Oxford scholar, a theory so radical it seemed almost heretical when first proposed, yet so well supported by evidence that it's forcing the archaeological world to reconsider everything we thought we knew about one of history's greatest mysteries. What if the Hanging Gardens of Babylon weren't in Babylon at all? What if, instead of searching through the dusty ruins of Babylon, archaeologists should have been looking 300 miles to the north in the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh? This revolutionary theory emerged from the meticulous work of Dr. Stephanie Dalley, an Oxford scholar who spent decades translating ancient cuneiform texts that most historians had overlooked. While everyone else was focused on the famous Greek and Roman accounts of the gardens, Dalley was digging deeper into contemporary Assyrian records written by the people who actually lived in ancient Mesopotamia. And what she found changed everything. In the royal archives of the Assyrian kings, Dalley discovered something extraordinary: detailed, first-hand accounts of magnificent hanging gardens built not in Babylon, but in Nineveh. These weren't vague legends written centuries after the fact. These were contemporary inscriptions carved in stone by the very king who built them, King Sennacherib of Assyria, who ruled from 705 to 681 BCE. Sennacherib was Nebuchadnezzar's predecessor by nearly a century, and like his Babylonian counterpart, he was obsessed with architectural grandeur. But unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib left behind extensive documentation of a specific project that sounds remarkably familiar. In his own words, carved into stone tablets that survive to this day, he described building a wonder for all people's elevated gardens filled with exotic plants from across his empire, watered by an revolutionary system of aqueducts and water-lifting screws. The parallels to the classical descriptions of the hanging gardens are uncanny. Sennacherib wrote about importing cotton plants from distant India, aromatic herbs from mountain regions, and fruit trees from Babylonia itself. He described creating artificial hills covered with vegetation, supported by massive stone archways, that allowed people to walk beneath the suspended gardens. Most remarkably, he detailed the engineering systems needed to make it all work: bronze screws that lifted water from distant rivers, stone aqueducts that spanned valleys, and precisely calculated canal systems that brought water from the mountains. But here's what makes Dalley's theory truly compelling. Unlike the phantom evidence at Babylon, the archaeological record at Nineveh tells a completely different story. The ruins around modern-day Mosul, Iraq, ancient Nineveh, are littered with evidence of exactly the kind of advanced hydraulic engineering Sennacherib described. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a massive aqueduct system stretching over 50 miles from the mountains to the city. The centerpiece of this system was a monumental stone bridge spanning the Jirwan Valley, built from over 2 million carefully dressed limestone blocks and sealed with waterproof cement, an engineering marvel that you can still visit today. The precision of this construction rivals anything built by the Romans centuries later. But the engineering evidence is just the beginning. Palace reliefs discovered at Nineveh show detailed scenes of gardens that match the classical descriptions perfectly. These aren't artistic fantasies, they're documentary evidence carved by artists who could actually see what they were depicting. One relief shows trees growing on terraced platforms supported by stone archways. Another depicts the elaborate water systems feeding the gardens, with channels and aqueducts cutting across the landscape. Most striking of all is what archaeologists call the garden relief, a stone carving from Sennacherib's palace, showing trees literally hanging in the air on terraces, with plants suspended on stone arches that perfectly match the architectural remains found along Sennacherib's waterway system. It's as if someone carved a picture of the hanging gardens and left it for us to find 3,000 years later. The visual evidence is supported by physical archaeology. Excavations at Nineveh have revealed elaborate garden terraces, sophisticated drainage systems, and most remarkably, the remains of bronze water-lifting screws exactly like those described in Sennacherib's inscriptions. These mechanical devices, which used rotating helical screws to lift water to higher elevations, represent cutting-edge technology for their time, precisely the kind of innovation needed to create hanging gardens. The topography of Nineveh also makes far more sense than Babylon for such an ambitious project. While Babylon sits on relatively flat terrain beside the Euphrates River, Nineveh was built on rolling hills along the Tigris, with natural elevation changes that would have made terraced gardens both more feasible and more dramatic in appearance. The mountainous terrain surrounding the city provided the elevation difference needed for Sennacherib's gravity-fed water system, allowing him to channel water from distant sources and deliver it under pressure to the highest levels of his gardens. So why did history get it wrong? How did the achievements of an Assyrian king become attributed to a Babylonian ruler a century later? The answer lies in the complex relationship between these two great Mesopotamian powers, and the confusion that followed in later centuries. Assyria and Babylon were bitter rivals for much of their history, but in 689 BCE, Sennacherib conquered Babylon and destroyed much of the city. In the aftermath of this conquest, Nineveh was sometimes referred to as New Babylon, and Sennacherib even renamed his city gates after the famous gates of conquered Babylon. This symbolic appropriation of Babylonian identity created exactly the kind of confusion that could fool later historians. When Greek writers like Diodorus Siculus described gardens built by a Syrian king, a term that could apply to any Mesopotamian ruler, they may have been working from garbled accounts that mixed up the two cities. By the time Alexander the Great's historians encountered the ruins of Sennacherib's engineering works, Assyria had fallen and Babylon had been rebuilt, making it natural to assume that the more famous city was the source of such marvels. The confusion was compounded by the translation of place names. Babylon literally means gate of the gods, and since Sennacherib had renamed his gates after deities, later writers might have interpreted references to Nineveh as references to a Babylon, any city that served as a gate to the divine realm. But perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence for Dali's theory isn't architectural or archaeological. It's the silence from Babylon itself. If Nebuchadnezzar II really had built one of the seven wonders of the world, why didn't he write about it? This was a king who documented everything, who filled his inscriptions with detailed accounts of far less impressive building projects. His silence about the gardens is deafening, especially when compared to Sennacherib's extensive contemporary documentation of his own garden project. The implications of Dali's research extend far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. If she's right, and the evidence strongly suggests she is, then we're looking at one of history's most persistent and influential mistakes. For over 2 millennia, the wrong city has been celebrated as the home of one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. This isn't just an academic correction, it's a fundamental challenge to how we understand the relationship between legend and reality in ancient history. The Hanging Gardens have inspired countless works of art, literature, and architecture over the centuries. They've shaped our image of ancient Mesopotamia and influenced how we think about the relationship between power and beauty in the ancient world, all based on a geographical error that has persisted for 2,000 years. But there's something almost poetic about this mix-up. The real gardens weren't built by a lovesick king for his homesick queen. They were created by a conqueror who wanted to demonstrate his power over nature itself. Sennacherib's gardens weren't a romantic gesture, but a political statement, a way of showing that Assyrian engineering could transform the natural world and create paradise through human ingenuity and imperial resources. The gardens represented something far more complex than simple horticultural ambition. They were a manifestation of what scholars now call imperial botany, the practice of collecting and displaying plants from across a conquered empire as a living symbol of dominion. Every exotic flower, every foreign fruit tree, every aromatic herb represented a territory brought under Assyrian control. When visitors walked through Sennacherib's elevated paradise, they weren't just admiring beautiful plants, they were witnessing a three-dimensional map of imperial conquest. This makes the confusion between Nineveh and Babylon even more historically significant. By attributing the gardens to Nebuchadnezzar, later writers transformed a cold demonstration of military power into a warm story of romantic love. The real gardens weren't about making a homesick queen happy. They were about making conquered peoples understand the futility of resistance against Assyrian might. Sennacherib's own inscriptions make this clear. He didn't describe his gardens as a gift to anyone. Instead, He boasted about gathering plants from mountains and Babylonia, specifically mentioning his southern rival as a source of botanical tribute. The gardens were a victory monument disguised as a park, a way of literally elevating the spoils of war above the Assyrian capital for all to see. The engineering required to create this political statement was staggering even by modern standards. Consider the logistics. Sennacherib's water system had to transport millions of gallons of fresh water daily across 50 miles of desert and mountain terrain, then lift it nearly 8 stories into the air to reach the highest garden terraces. The bronze screws alone, each weighing several tons, and requiring precision casting techniques that wouldn't be perfected again for centuries, represent a level of metallurgical sophistication that challenges our assumptions about ancient technology. Recent archaeological analysis has revealed just how advanced these systems really were. The waterproof cement used in Sennacherib's aqueducts contains additives that wouldn't be rediscovered until Roman times. The stone blocks were cut with a precision that suggests the use of advanced measuring instruments. Most remarkably, the water screws show evidence of mass production techniques, implying that Assyrian craftsmen had developed standardized manufacturing processes 1,500 years before the Industrial Revolution. But the most ingenious aspect of Sennacherib's system wasn't mechanical, it was hydraulic. By sourcing water from mountain streams at high elevation, he created a gravity-fed network that generated enough pressure to power his lifting screws without requiring human or animal labor. Water flowed downhill through precisely calculated channels, building momentum that could then be redirected upward through his bronze mechanisms. It was a perpetual motion system powered by geography itself. This level of engineering sophistication helps explain why later Greek and Roman writers were so amazed by what they saw. When Alexander the Great's army camped near the Jerwan aqueduct in 331 BCE, they would have witnessed infrastructure that surpassed anything in the Mediterranean world. The massive stone bridge, the sophisticated water management, the mechanical lifting devices, all of it would have seemed like magic to visitors from civilizations that still relied on simple pulleys and basic hydraulics. The Greek historians who documented these marvels faced a translation problem that may have contributed to the geographical confusion. Assyrian technical terminology didn't translate easily into Greek, and concepts like pressurized water systems or mechanical advantage were difficult to explain to audiences who had never seen such technology. When these writers tried to describe bronze screws lifting water as if by invisible hands, they were grappling with engineering principles that wouldn't be formalized in Greek mathematics for another century. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sennacherib's gardens survived for nearly a century after his death, maintained by his successors who understood their symbolic importance. Reliefs from the reign of his grandson Ashurbanipal show the gardens in full maturity, with massive trees creating canopied walkways above water channels carved into living rock. These later depictions reveal details that match classical descriptions almost perfectly: the stone archways, the suspended vegetation, the interplay of architecture and horticulture that made the gardens seem to defy natural law. But the gardens' fate was tied to Assyria's political fortunes. When Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes in 612 BCE, the city was systematically destroyed. The conquerors didn't just tear down buildings, they dismantled the infrastructure that made urban life possible. The aqueducts were broken, the water screws were melted down for bronze, and the elaborate irrigation systems were abandoned to the desert. Within a generation, the site that had once hosted one of the world's most magnificent gardens had returned to scrubland. The engineering knowledge needed to maintain such systems was lost, along with the craftsmen who had built them. By the time Nebuchadnezzar II rose to power in Babylon 60 years later, the memory of Sennacherib's achievement was already fading into legend. This destruction explains another puzzle that has long bothered historians. Why do classical sources disagree about so many details of the gardens? If later writers were working from fragmentary accounts of ruins they had never seen, it makes sense that descriptions would vary wildly. Some might have been based on Assyrian reliefs depicting the gardens at their peak, while others could have drawn from eyewitness accounts of the abandoned site decades after its destruction. The confusion deepened as political control of Mesopotamia shifted between different empires. When the Persians conquered both Assyria and Babylon, they inherited administrative records that may have mixed up the achievements of different kings. Persian bureaucrats copying older documents might not have distinguished clearly between Assyrian and Babylonian rulers, especially when both had controlled the same territories at different times. By the time Greek scholars began systematically studying Mesopotamian history, they were working from sources that had passed through multiple translations and political transitions. The original Assyrian records were written in cuneiform script that few Greeks could read. Persian administrators had translated some material into Aramaic. Local guides and interpreters added their own layers of interpretation and confusion. In this environment, it would have been easy for a Greek writer to hear about magnificent gardens built by a great king in Mesopotamia and assume they must have been located in the region's most famous city. Babylon's reputation as a center of wealth and wonder made it a natural candidate for hosting such marvels, even if the actual evidence pointed elsewhere. The irony is that this geographical mistake may have saved the gardens' place in history. If classical writers had correctly attributed them to Assyria, the gardens might have been forgotten along with most other Assyrian achievements when that empire fell into obscurity. By accidentally connecting them to Babylon, a city that remained famous throughout the ancient world, the confusion ensured that Sennacherib's horticultural masterpiece would be remembered and celebrated for millennia. But this preservation came at a cost. The real story of the gardens, their function as imperial propaganda, their revolutionary engineering, their role in Assyrian political culture, was buried beneath layers of romantic fiction. The gardens became a symbol of love conquering nature rather than power conquering geography. Their true significance as a milestone in hydraulic engineering and botanical science was lost in favor of a more appealing but entirely fictional narrative. Dr. Daly's research represents more than just a correction to an old mistake. It's a reminder that our understanding of the ancient world is still evolving, still subject to revision, when new evidence emerges or old evidence is re-examined with fresh eyes. The tools and techniques that allowed her to decode Assyrian inscriptions, advanced linguistics, comparative archaeology, satellite imaging of ancient sites weren't available to earlier generations of scholars who had to rely on limited sources and imperfect translations. Her work also demonstrates how persistent historical myths can become self-reinforcing. Because everyone knew the gardens were in Babylon, archaeologists focused their excavations there, ignoring evidence from other sites that might have told a different story. Because classical sources seemed to agree on the basic location, few scholars thought to question whether those sources might be systematically wrong about a fundamental fact. The Hanging Gardens case reveals something troubling about how historical knowledge gets established and perpetuated. Sometimes the most confident assertions are based on the weakest evidence, while the most important discoveries hide in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to challenge conventional wisdom. This pattern repeats throughout archaeological history. Troy was dismissed as mythical until Heinrich Schliemann proved otherwise. The Minoan civilization was unknown until Arthur Evans uncovered it. The extent of Viking exploration was underestimated until Lanceau Meadows was excavated. In each case, physical evidence eventually forced scholars to revise theories that had seemed unshakable. The garden story is still unfolding. While Daly's Nineveh theory has gained widespread acceptance among specialists, the broader public continues to associate the gardens with Babylon. Popular culture, tourist sites, and educational materials still perpetuate the old attribution, creating a lag between scholarly consensus and public understanding that may take decades to resolve. Meanwhile, archaeologists continue to excavate both sites, searching for additional evidence that might confirm or refute Daly's conclusions. New techniques in remote sensing, chemical analysis, and digital reconstruction are revealing details about ancient Mesopotamian cities that previous generations could never have imagined. Each discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that has captivated humanity for over 2 millennia. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Hanging Gardens mystery isn't about ancient history at all. It's about the relationship between evidence and belief, between what we want to be true and what actually happened. The romantic story of Nebuchadnezzar building a paradise for his beloved queen appeals to something deep in human nature, our desire to believe that love and beauty can triumph over harsh reality. The actual story of an Assyrian king using advanced engineering to create a propaganda display from conquered territories is less emotionally satisfying but more intellectually fascinating. It reveals the sophisticated technical capabilities of ancient civilizations while illustrating the complex relationship between power, nature, and imperial identity in the ancient world. In the end, both stories matter. The fictional gardens of Babylon have inspired countless works of art and literature, shaping how we imagine the relationship between human ambition and natural beauty. The real gardens of Nineveh offer insights into ancient engineering and imperial ideology that help us understand how complex societies managed resources and projected power. The mystery isn't completely solved. Questions remain about exactly how Sennacherib's water systems worked, whether his gardens really matched all the details in classical descriptions, and how the geographical confusion first arose. Archaeological work continues at both Babylon and Nineveh, with each excavation season potentially bringing new evidence that could further refine our understanding. But one thing has become clear: the ancient world was far more sophisticated, far more interconnected, and far more capable of technological innovation than previous generations of scholars believed possible. The Hanging Gardens, whether in Babylon or Nineveh, represent human ingenuity at its finest, the marriage of engineering prowess with aesthetic vision, the transformation of political power into living beauty. As we stand on the edge of our own technological revolution, grappling with questions about how to balance human ambition with natural limits, the ancient gardens offer both inspiration and warning. They show us what's possible when civilizations commit resources and expertise to creating something beautiful rather than destructive. But they also remind us that even the most magnificent human achievements are temporary, subject to the rise and fall of the societies that create them. The search for the true Hanging Gardens continues, driven by the same curiosity and wonder that first inspired ancient writers to include them among the 7 wonders of the world. In archives and excavation sites, in satellite images and chemical analyses, scholars are still uncovering the secrets of these vanished marvels. Each discovery brings us closer to understanding not just what the gardens were, but what they meant to the people who built them and the civilizations that remembered them. The gardens may be gone, but their story lives on, a testament to human creativity, a puzzle for archaeological science, and a reminder that sometimes the most important truths are hidden in the places we least expect to find them. The truth about the Hanging Gardens forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about how history gets written and rewritten. For over 2,000 years, tourists have traveled to Iraq expecting to find traces of Nebuchadnezzar's romantic masterpiece. Tour guides have pointed to empty patches of ground in Babylon, explaining where the gardens probably stood before time erased them. Museums have displayed artistic reconstructions based on classical descriptions, creating vivid images of something that may never have existed in that location. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the north, the actual ruins of Sennacherib's engineering marvel lie scattered across the landscape around Mosul, largely ignored by the tourist industry and overlooked by popular culture. The massive aqueduct stones at Jerwan, the precisely carved water channels, the foundation terraces that once supported hanging vegetation, all of it sits in relative obscurity, while the world continues to search for gardens in the wrong place. This disconnect reveals something profound about the relationship between physical evidence and cultural memory. The Babylon attribution has become so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness that correcting it feels almost like destroying a beloved myth. The romantic story of a king building paradise for his homesick queen satisfies our need for meaning in ways that the technical achievement of an imperial water engineer simply cannot match. But there's something equally compelling about the real story, once you dig beneath the surface. Sennacherib wasn't just showing off his engineering skills, he was making a statement about the relationship between human will and natural law. In a region where water meant life and elevation meant power, creating an artificial mountain covered with vegetation from conquered territories was the ultimate display of imperial dominance. The psychological impact on visitors must have been overwhelming. Imagine approaching Nineveh from the south, traveling across dusty plains under the scorching Mesopotamian Sunday. As you crest the final hill before the city, suddenly the landscape transforms. Massive stone arches rise before you, supporting layers of green vegetation that seem to float in mid-air. Water cascades down carved channels, creating pools and streams where none should exist. The air itself changes, becoming cooler and more humid as you enter this artificial oasis. This wasn't just beautiful, it was impossible, according to everything visitors thought they knew about how the world worked. In an age before mechanical engineering was widely understood, Sennacherib's gardens would have seemed like magic made manifest. The bronze screws lifting water against gravity, the stone aqueducts spanning valleys, the precise hydraulic calculations that made it all function. These represented technologies that most ancient civilizations couldn't even conceptualize, let alone construct. So here we stand, 3,000 years later, still mesmerized by gardens that may never have grown where we thought they did. The Hanging Gardens remain one of history's most beautiful mysteries, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful truths hide behind the stories we tell ourselves. Whether built by love or conquest, in Babylon or Nineveh, they whisper the same eternal question: what impossible dreams are we brave enough to make real?